Let's look at some advanced features of macros. Let's write a macro that will reset all of our faders to their home positions, and that means we'll take proportional subs down to 0, and we'll take inhibitive subs up to full. So I'm going to learn that as macro 11, learn 11, enter. And once again, my learning macro 11 flashes, and my learn button on my face panel is flashing to let me know that I'm in learn mode. And from a clear command line, I have the fader soft key. So I'm going to go ahead and say fader 1 through home, and I'm going to hit enter, and that's going to allow me to home all those faders. I'm going to hit learn again, and that will stop the learning process. I'm going to clear my command line, and now you'll see that if I bring down some of my inhibs, push up some of my other faders, and I run macro 11, all those guys will creep back in the manual time. For this particular macro, you'll notice that my motorized faders tracked automatically as the content moved. If you're working on non-motorized hardware, you'll need to take the fader to the level of the content in order to regain control. Let's talk about macro modes. Macro modes allow you to choose whether a macro runs on your command line, so that can modify things that you're already typing, or you can run things off of your command line. And sometimes if you're running things on your command line, it can interrupt what you're doing. So for example, if I were to say 1 through 10, and then I were to run my macro 11, I'm going to get a syntax error because when channel's on my command line, I can't do anything with my fader. So I'm going to hit Shift Clear, and I'm going to open my macro editor. And if I type macro 11, that will take me down to that macro. You'll notice right now that the mode column is blank. So I'm going to hit macro mode, and that will take me to foreground mode. If this macro is in foreground mode, it's always going to run on my command line, and that isn't what I want. So I'll hit macro mode again, and that will take me to background mode. When a macro is in background mode, it will still execute, but it won't interrupt your command line as it runs. So now let's go do that example again. I'm going to move some of my faders away from their positions. And then if I happen to have 1 through 10 on the command line because I'm working with them and I need to reset my faders, I can now say macro 11, it's going to run in the background, and my command line isn't affected. Let's look at some of the other macro functions that we can use in our macro editor. So I'll double hit macro again. And I'm going to look at my macro 3. So I'm going to type 3, enter. And this is a set of functions that I can use on my command line. Because this is syntax that I will use on my command line, I want to make sure that I set the macro mode to be foreground. And that's going to ensure that it always runs on my command line. For now, I'm going to hit my edit soft key. I can also hit learn on my face panel to start editing this macro. And I want to make a modification to this macro. Instead of having this record the focus palette next, I want to be able to type in the focus palette number as I'm running this macro. So I'm going to use my delete soft key, which will remove that. Keep in mind, if you use your delete hard key on your face panel, it will add that to your macro. And I'm going to add another soft key, which is on my second page of soft keys, which is wait for input. And when wait for input is in a macro, it's going to pause the macro and allow me to type in a value. When I'm running this macro, after I put in my focus palette number, I can also continue that command. So I'm going to go ahead and put label as the next command in my macro. And I want to leave the command line unterminated so that I can actually label it. So I'll use my delete soft key to remove that enter press. And now I'm going to hit learn or done in order to finish that macro. So let's run an example of this macro. I'm going to pop out into live. And for the sake of today, I want to put myself in snapshot 4. So using my direct selects, I'm going to grab my OS movers, and I'm going to go ahead and put them in the X stage look. That'll give us a nice cross stage. And I'm going to tilt those fixtures up just a little bit more like that. So now if I want to record that as a new focus palette, I can use my record next focus palette macro, which I'll hit. You'll notice that the macro is still running and it's waiting for input. So I want this palette to be 21. And then if I hit macro again, that will continue the rest of the macro, which allows me to label it, which I'm going to type high cross and hit enter. And now my macro is complete. Macros also have the ability to get little color flags in their direct select corners, similar to what color palettes do in direct selects. And that can also be reflective on hardware. So I'm going to go back into my macro editor, and you'll notice one of my soft keys is color. So I'm going to say next to get down to my macro 4. And my RFR enable, I'm going to go ahead and make that color be green. And you'll notice in my direct select, I get the little green corner flag. And I'm also going to go ahead and say macro 5, color, red, enter. And now I get a red color flag there. So this just helps me find macros more easily based on what they're doing. On consoles with built-in touchscreens, you'll notice that we have buttons that are assigned to macros, and those are backlit as well, so if you have macros that live in those locations, they'll light up under those colors. So I'm going to go ahead and say 4 and 5, move 2, which is copy 2 twice, 819, enter. And because I've placed those macros in slots 819 and 820, you can see that my hardware lights up with those colors. And just for some housekeeping, I want to make sure that all my macros are labeled so I know what they do. I'm going to make sure I have macro 11 labeled as reset faders. Just to point out some of the other columns in the macro editor, target device allows you to run a macro on a specific user or device in a network. So for example, if I'm the programmer, this allows me to run a snapshot on my designer's RVI, which is always nice. Also, sclearn can be disabled on individual macros, and this prevents those macros from being recorded while we're learning show control events. If you don't choose a mode for your macro, this is called the default mode. And the default mode means that if you call the macro, for example, you type macro 11, or you press a direct select with macro 11 on it, it will run in the foreground. However, if the system calls the macro, for example, a queue executes a macro, or maybe a startup or shutdown macro runs, it will run in the background. So for consistency, you'll want to select either foreground or background for all of your macros, depending on the function of each macro. There's one other thing that I'd like to point out about macros, and that is that we can set startup, shutdown, and disconnect macros. So I'm going to hit displays and setup. And you'll notice in the system settings of my system menu, we have startup macro, shutdown macro, and disconnect macro. The startup macro will be the first thing that the console does as soon as the software boots. The last thing the console will do as the software is exited is run the shutdown macro. And if you're using a full tracking backup, if the primary and the backup become disconnected, they will run a disconnect macro. For now, we're going to skip adding those and just go straight back out into live.